As we have highlighted over the past few tutorials, the modern era in philosophy was characterized by significant societal changes with major humanist and intellectual focuses, changes which profoundly impacted philosophical thought as a whole. In addition to the rapid growth of scientific and technological progress, many political theories and systems aligned with revolutions of the time, and stark governmental changes arose during the entire period. Niccoló Machiavelli was the first to write on political topics in this new vein of political philosophy in the Renaissance during the late 15th and early 16th centuries, though like many others we have seen, he never considered himself a philosopher, and he certainly did not write as one. The Machiavellian adjective, meaning cunning and scheming, that many may be familiar with, comes from an exaggeration of his political writings, often referred to as an early amoral utilitarianism, present predominantly in The Prince, a very objective and calculating guide to becoming a powerful politician, wholly detached from any moral repercussions of one's actions. Regarding Plato and similar political models as utopian, Machiavelli detaches morality and strong metaphysical principles from any political subject in favor of a strong pragmatic perspective toward the guidelines of a ruler. Doing so did not mean he wrote an evil plan for tyrants, but that he was more concerned with the practical aspects of direct actions and governability, and how they will impact not only the people, but especially the rulers themselves. One of the main points made by Machiavelli in this regard is that a state governor should have a flexible disposition in their value system, deliberately enacting good and evil when needed. This is what Machiavelli calls virtù, not to be mistaken for moral virtue, but a set of political attributes that a leader must have to maintain power over the state. If the political leader has virtù, they can control fortune or fortuna, which is the source of political disorder. Fortuna was the Roman goddess of luck, both bad and good, an image Machiavelli lends to represent the forces of destiny, of things that are not in our control and which can happen any time, disrupting the governor's power, such as famine, rebellions, or conspiracies. Hence, the prince is recommended to master virtù, and in doing so he will be able to deal with fortune, either by brute force or by making alliances and agreements to remain in power. Thus, the Machiavellian legacy is based on a misquote referencing his view: the ends justify the means. Though they are in the spirit of his writings, he never wrote these exact words, and they seldom reference his practical focus on the possible direct effects of an action or policy above any abstract principles or detached reasoning. It is thus amoral, for it is not actively good or evil, merely practical and calculist, and it is utilitarian in that it focuses on the results rather than the process itself. Thomas Hobbes, who we remember from our discussion of empiricism, had a similar mindset with his extremely materialistic worldview aligned with the practical effects and properties of reason. Apart from any metaphysical or divine influence on our behavior, he reflected on what life would be without government, or in a hypothetical state of nature. With the characteristic xenophobic and Eurocentric perspective of his time, Hobbes thought that people in the wild without governmental control would be lawless savages, killing and damaging each other with no limit or punishment. Thus he wrote the Leviathan after a large mythical monster, comparing it to the necessary role of the government, an overpowering, massive, intimidating entity which only through its overwhelming power is capable of maintaining a civil society. For this we must accept a hypothetical contract as rational and free people in order to live with each other harmoniously. In this contract, people would abdicate their own natural rights and transfer them to a leader, which would be the tyrant responsible for keeping people in line and establishing civic order. This political theory is called contractualism or social contract theory and is still discussed to this day. John Locke, on the other hand, though he claimed that humanity is naturally inclined to live under a monarchy, focused greatly on individual rights and liberty which are inherent to all citizens, claiming that a government which does not respect them must be overthrown. Today, we know that statements like this coming from Locke should be taken with a grain of salt, given that, besides his thoughts on liberty and individual rights, although he had argued against the colonial regime, he also owned stocks in the slave market and drafted a document that supported hereditary nobility and slavery in the Carolinas institution. In addition, he was also the first to write on the separation of church and state, affirming that none could coerce citizens to any faith, and also the separation of the legislative and executive power with a focus on the rule of majority. Montesquieu also wrote extensively in the early 18th century on these separations, adding the judicial branch and focusing on an interdependency of all three in order for none to abuse another. In the vein of empiricism, he focused on a naturalistic perspective of politics through a comparative anthropological analysis of peoples, institutions, and governments in order to understand political theory. He then identified different classes and governmental powers and set apart the three mentioned powers, legislative, executive, and judicial, as administrative, in contrast with the sovereign power. These postulations would help in avoiding despotism, or the exercise of absolute power, and also break with the remaining previous feudalistic models that were still relevant. Another French author, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, wrote in a similar model as Hobbes. He identified a state of nature and reflected on what the role of government should be. However, contrary to Hobbes, Rousseau defended that our natural state would be of true freedom, harmony, peace, and tranquility, while the state and the rational focus on the citizen would shackle us into tyranny. He criticized philosophy as being merely a fictional narrative of egotistical aristocrats toward the enslavement of the people, defending that its teaching and all its focus on rationality should be abandoned toward a learning focused on compassion and freedom. His ideal social contract involved every individual agreeing to have the same rights and duties, and also accepting a democratic regime ruled by the general will, or the collective will of all of its citizens. The only just state would be the one following these ideas. By the same time, Scottish economist and philosopher Adam Smith formulated similar, however lighter, criticisms of philosophy in the role of politics, and gave praise to everyday common sense. Philosophy should be the rationalization, as in creating fictitious explanations after the facts, and elitist organization of everyday experience. Therefore, for him, moral systems and general theories would be improved if they arose from this real context, instead of from an abstract, selective vantage point. His book on economics, The Wealth of Nations, is widely known and still frequently cited, while his significantly larger work on morality, Theory of Moral Sentiments, is typically overlooked, even though it is the basis on which he develops his theory of economy. Smith embraces Hume's moral sentimentalism, praising sympathy, or empathy as the word is currently used, not only while attempting to understand political and financial relationships from the perspective of the average citizen, but also as the pillar of his more famous concept of the invisible hand, which is responsible for the self-regulation of markets, as is discussed over in the economics series. Many refer to this concept without acquiescing to the whole moral theory behind his formulation. The market would not regulate itself because there was an unknown formula or inherent harmony that would keep the prices from exploding, but because the divine moral sentiment within us would not let us abuse each other with monopolies, extreme pricing, or the like. Another idea he took from Hume was his skepticism about the role of government upon the finances of its citizens, again for being too far from their everyday contexts. Likewise, business people should refrain from governmental work as they could unjustly impose their self-interest upon other citizens. Smith also extensively wrote on the advantage of learning toward specialization and the individual rights of workers toward a healthier and thus more productive work environment. Toward the end of the 18th century, many elements of the democratic and economic systems of today were clearly taking shape through modern political philosophy. In the next tutorial, we will see how these themes develop throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, and then wrap up our study of modernity with some authors in between modernity and contemporary times, culminating with a review of the logical developments during this period.
Thanks for watching. Subscribe to my channel for more tutorials. Support me on Patreon so I can keep making content. And as always, feel free to email me, ProfessorDaveExplains@gmail.com.